Edward Westing was my grandfather. He lived in this house we're in today. My Uncle Neil actually built the house for him in 1938. I got to know him better when I got older and had a chance to work with my father in the darkroom with Edward's negatives. So that was my connection to Edward, was actually living through his negatives, helping my father print them. I couldn't believe when I'd go over to a friend's house that they didn't have a darkroom. I mean, I grew up, we had darkrooms, and you don't really think, that this is anything special. You go out on photography trips, you take your cameras, we lived actually quite a ways down the coast and it was very isolated, so didn't get into town much. So yeah, to me it was a very natural thing to go into the darkroom. Edward had a lot of friends, and that was, growing up, was very intriguing to me because I knew he had spent time in Mexico. And he had friends like Diego Rivera, Orozco. Of course, he went there with Tina Modote. So to me, that was a very romantic, in Mexico and all these famous painters and sculptors. And I really, and I would see the images. I was printing with my dad, helping him in the darkroom, printing portraits of Diego Rivera, Orozco, and of course the great nudes of Tina. The guest book is a fascinating document of people that came and visited Edward here at the house. It was a real treasure to have it at the house and see all the people that came through. Very famous people, architects, painters, of course also his friends, like Ansel Adams. I think he signed it 3 or 4 times. And of course, my father signed it, so there's this long history of names of people that visited him while he lived here. Edward really never sold a lot of work. He died a relatively monetarily poor man. His legacy lives on through his being as a photographer and all the respect that he got from actually bringing black and white photography to an art form. I don't think he ever sold a print for more than $35. His prints now, original prints, done by him, one sold for $1.6 million. I think he would be quite shocked at that, And you look at the house here, it's very humble, very simple house. He did what he loved to do. He loved to photograph. And as you see in his darkroom and stuff, how simple it is and how basic it is. That's how he lived his life. He was driven up to this area in Carmel, I think because of the rich history of the different artists that were living here. He had met Ansel Adams up in San Francisco. He knew that Adams had a house down here in Carmel. And so he gravitated to this area. And of course, his favorite spot is Point Lobos, which really drew him to photograph there. I think what Point Lobos meant to Edward was a place to go and photograph very close to his house. Edward never drove, so he could actually walk from here to Point Lobos, which he did frequently. And it's funny that Edward wasn't the first Weston to photograph at Point Lobos. Brett was. And Edward was visiting Ansel Adams up in Yosemite. And Brett had a friend that said, hey, I'm going to take you to this spot called Point Lobos. And Brett went in there and just went crazy. Because a lot of people think it was Edward that was the first Weston. No, it was Brett. Brett, who had a little studio in Carmel, Brett came down while his dad was still up in Yosemite, took all of Edward's photographs off the wall, put all his new Point Lobos photographs up on the wall, and waited for his father to come home. And they had such a wonderful relationship. There wasn't any jealousy or Edward wasn't mad that he had taken the Edward's photographs down. He just looked at the photographs and said, Brett, you have to take me to this spot. And that's how Edward got to Point Lobos. Edward photographed at Point Lobos his whole life. In fact, his last photograph he ever took was at Point Lobos. So it was a continuing canvas for him to work with, constantly changing. A lot of times when he got older, he got sick with Parkinson's, he would still go out there, he would still photograph. The last photograph he took He was with a group, a workshop, and I forget who was teaching it. And a student asked him, he said, "Mr. Westing, you know, what do I photograph?" And he said to the student, and Edward had his camera there, he said, "You should be able to look at your feet and find a photograph." And he tilted the camera down and shot the last photograph he ever did of these rocks just below his feet. I grew up in a family that's all they did, is they photographed, you know, and you become what a lot of your surroundings is. So at 6 years old, I pick up a camera, and being basically a very shy kid, loved to spend hours in the darkroom. And I'd go in there and help my dad. And it was a darkroom we had down in Garrapatta. And it had this big door on it, you know, and you'd open up the door. And then there was this large army tarpaulin that you had to work your way through. And it always smelled like hypo, you know, and it was this dark, dank little darkroom. And I loved it, you know. I'd sit on the chair there and help my dad run the negatives through the fixer. And I always felt very lucky because I knew from that age of 6 years old, this is what I wanted to do. Black and white is very simple to do. Color at that time was very complicated. Usually would have to send it out to a lab, you know, it was dye transfer. You know, when Cibachrome came around, it was a process you could color, you know, do color prints at home. But so for me, just economically, I just did black and white. It was very simple, you know, and very rudimentary in its process. And never wanted to do color. You know, it's kind of ironic now that I paint on my photographs and put color back into them. But no, it was always black and white. It was always something that I could control, you know. It's like anything, it's a tool. And that was my passion. The darkroom is a magic place for me. And I don't think you ever get tired. And I think as a young boy, I'm watching that image come up from a blank piece of paper was so magical. I mean, I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. It's the magic of what that art form is, you know, and oh yeah, there are days when you're in the darkroom and it's like, it's work. And you know, it's like any profession. But there are days that, so many other days that you're sitting there and you've you know, created a great negative and now you're gonna make a print and there it is. I mean, there's your language, there's what you've worked your whole life to produce, you know. Art can be a very selfish thing, but it can also be something that you really want to share. And when you see that image, you know, and it's right, it's a great feeling.